Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The mornings here are quiet, usually very quiet. Silence that stretches, yawns, and swallows sound whole. No birds, no wind, just the soft creak of the cabin settling in the cool September air. That morning wasn't any different, at least not at first. Bo was scratching at the door like usual, his way of saying, "Walk now or deal with me later." I grabbed his leash, threw on my boots, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, crisp enough to wake me up faster than coffee. We started our walk along the edge of the property, where the pines press in on one side and the wheat field sprawls out on the other. Bo always loved this route, nose to the ground, tail wagging like he was on the trail of something big. But today, he was different. His nose stayed up, ears twitching at every rustle in the field. His steps weren't playful. They were cautious, deliberate. It put me on edge, even if I didn't want to admit it. The wheat was high that year, taller than me in some spots. I hated it. Couldn't see a damn thing past the first couple rows, and it always felt like something was just out of sight. Watching. Bo stopped, his body stiff. His growl started low, the kind that made your stomach knot up, the kind that said, "We're not alone." "Coyotes, probably," I muttered, trying to convince myself as much as him. But coyotes didn't usually make Bo act like this. He pulled at the leash, digging his paws into the dirt like he wanted to drag me straight into the wheat. "Knock it off, Bo," I said, yanking him back. His growl turned into a bark, sharp and urgent. Then I heard it. A soft whimper, high-pitched, like a puppy crying out for help. It came from the wheat. I froze. There weren't any dogs around here that I knew of, no neighbors for miles. The sound came again, closer this time. "Probably some stray," I said, though it sounded more like a question. I took a step forward, and Bo went wild, barking and pulling harder than ever. All right," I said, backing up. "We're going." But as I turned to leave, the whimper changed. It stretched, warbled, like a record spinning too slow. And then it was something else entirely. A growl, deep and guttural, vibrating through my chest. Bo lunged at the wheat, his leash cutting into my hand. "Bo, stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The wheat rustled, a heavy sound, like something big was moving through it. Not a dog, not a coyote, something bigger. I gripped Bo's leash tighter and pulled, practically dragging him back toward the cabin. The growl followed us, growing louder, sharper, and then it shifted again. This time it sounded human. A scream tore through the air, raw and ragged, like someone was being ripped apart. My feet moved faster than my brain could process, dragging Bo along as he barked and howled like he was trying to fight whatever was in that wheat. We reached the edge of the yard, and I glanced back just once. The wheat was still again, perfectly still, like nothing had ever been there. Bo stopped barking but kept growling, his eyes locked on the field. I didn't wait to see if anything came out. Inside the cabin, I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. Bo paced in front of the window, still growling low. I grabbed the curtain and yanked it shut. No way was I looking out there again. That scream, though, it stuck. It didn't sound like an animal. Didn't sound like a person either. It sounded wrong, like something trying to sound human and not quite getting it. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. I tried to work on some repairs around the cabin, but every small sound made me jump. Bo refused to leave my side, following me from room to room with his hackles still raised. By evening, I'd convinced myself it had to be some kind of sick animal. Maybe rabid. That would explain the strange sounds, the aggressive behavior. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. No rabid animal made sounds like that. No animal I'd ever heard could mimic a human scream so perfectly, then twist it into something else entirely. As darkness fell, I made sure every window was locked, every curtain drawn. The cabin had never felt smaller, the walls thinner. Outside, the wind picked up, making the wheat whisper secrets I didn't want to hear. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table, Bo curled up at my feet. I thought about the field, about how still it had looked after all that noise. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, just a stray dog or coyote. Then came the tapping on the window, light at first like a bird brushing against the glass, then heavier, deliberate. I didn't move. Bo's head shot up, his ears twitching. He growled low, a sound so deep it rumbled through the floorboards. The tapping stopped. I sat there, every muscle locked up, staring at the curtain like it was going to be ripped off at any second. But nothing happened. The cabin stayed quiet, except for Bo's growl and the faint sound of wind whispering through the wheat. The tapping resumed, this time at the back door. 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced, like someone knocking. But who would be out here at this hour? Who would walk through that field in the dark? I grabbed the shotgun from above the fireplace, checking that it was loaded. My hands were steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound authoritative. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from just beyond the door, came a voice. It was my own voice, distorted and hollow, repeating my words back to me. "Who's there?" I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over Bo. The voice came again, closer to the door now, still mimicking me, but wrong, like it was coming through water or from the bottom of a well. "Who's there? Who's there? Who's there?" Bo erupted in frenzied barking, throwing himself at the door. I grabbed his collar, pulling him back as the voice outside began to laugh. It was my laugh, but stretched and warped until it became something monstrous. The door handle rattled violently, then stopped. Everything stopped. The night pressed in around us, heavy and waiting. I didn't sleep that night, not even a little. I spent the morning cleaning up the scratches on my front door, long, jagged marks that ran deep into the wood, like something with claws had tried to get in. Bo sat by the window, watching the tree line, growling under his breath. He hadn't been himself since the day near the wheat, and neither had I. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore. Every creak of the walls, every gust of wind against the glass had me glancing over my shoulder. I needed answers. Something had been out there, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. I called Walter, my nearest neighbor, if you could call someone living 3 miles down a dirt road a neighbor. He picked up on the third ring, his voice gruff like he'd been expecting bad news. "What's going on, Charlie?" I told him everything. The wheat, the scream, the tapping on the window. I even told him about the claw marks and the voice, though I could hear how ridiculous it all sounded as the words tumbled out. He didn't laugh, didn't tell me to get some sleep or lay off the whiskey. Instead, there was a long pause, followed by a quiet, "You need to come by." I packed Bo into the truck and headed over. The drive felt longer than usual, the pine trees pressing in on either side of the road like they were trying to swallow it whole. Even Bo was uneasy, his ears twitching at every sound. The forest seemed darker than normal, shadows pooling in places where sunlight should have reached. Twice I thought I saw something moving between the trees, keeping pace with the truck, but when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Walter was waiting on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked older than I remembered, his face lined like someone who'd spent too many years staring into the woods. His eyes had a haunted quality I'd never noticed before, darting between me and the tree line behind me. He didn't say much, just waved me inside. His house was cluttered, walls lined with hunting trophies and old photographs. He poured us coffee and sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he lit another cigarette. The kitchen smelled of tobacco and something else, sage maybe, burning somewhere in the back rooms. "What you're dealing with," he started, "ain't something you can shoot or scare off. It's older than that. Old as the land itself." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Walter went on to tell me about a story he'd heard growing up. A legend passed down from the Ojibwe people who used to live on this land. They spoke of a guardian spirit, something tied to the woods and the fields. It wasn't evil, not exactly, but it didn't take kindly to being disturbed. They called it the Keeper, he said, his voice low. Said it watched over the land, made sure everything stayed in balance. But if you messed with it, dug up something you weren't supposed to, it'd come for you. He pulled out an old leather journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Inside were drawings, sketches of artifacts and symbols I didn't recognize. Some looked like they'd been copied from cave walls or ancient pottery. One page showed a figure, tall and distorted, standing at the edge of a field. The proportions were all wrong, arms too long, joints bending in impossible directions. My grandfather drew these, Walter explained. He was one of the last to see it back in '52. Lost 3 fingers to frostbite hiding in his root cellar for 2 days while that thing circled his house. Said it spoke in his dead wife's voice, trying to get him to open the door. That's when I remembered. The artifact. I told Walter about the carved piece of metal I'd found in the garden last week. How I'd tossed it near the edge of the field without thinking twice. His face darkened, the cigarette falling from his lips. You need to put it back, right where you found it, and you need to do it soon. I wanted to ask him why, wanted to push for more details. But something in his expression stopped me. Walter looked scared. The kind of fear that doesn't leave room for questions. He gave me a small leather pouch filled with tobacco and sage, told me to carry it with me when I went back. It might help, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. On the drive home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. I thought about the artifact, the weight of it in my hand, the strange carvings that seemed to twist and shift in the light. I'd found it buried deep, almost like it wasn't supposed to see daylight. The metal had been oddly warm to the touch, despite being underground, and the symbols carved into its surface had made my eyes water if I looked at them too long. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was nearly dark. The cabin loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly against the growing night. Bo bolted out of the truck and ran straight to the porch, his tail down, ears flat. The air felt wrong, too still, too quiet. Even the insects had gone silent, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since I'd left Walter's place. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the spot near the field where I'd left the artifact. The wheat was swaying, though there wasn't any wind. My footsteps crunched against the dirt path, louder than they should have been. Each step seemed to echo, as if the sound was bouncing off something just out of sight. The leather pouch Walter had given me felt warm against my chest, and I found myself gripping it like a lifeline. The artifact was still there, half buried where I'd tossed it. I crouched down, picking it up gingerly. It felt colder than I remembered, heavier. The carvings on its surface seemed deeper now, more intricate, like they'd grown in my absence. As I stood, a sound carried through the air, a low rhythmic hum, almost like chanting. It wasn't coming from the house or the woods. It was coming from the field. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight into the wheat. The light barely penetrated the stalks, but the sound grew louder, closer. The chanting had words now, though I couldn't understand them. They were in a language that predated memory, syllables that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. The wheat began to part, stalks bending away from something moving through them. A sharp, desperate sound that made me want to run. But I couldn't move. The wheat shifted, parting slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of something moving within. Tall, too tall, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its skin looked like bark in the flashlight beam, rough and deeply grooved. But it was the face that made my knees weak. It had my father's face, perfect in every detail, except the eyes were black pits that seemed to pull in the light. "Son," it said in my father's voice, though he'd been dead for 15 years. "You found something that belongs to us." The hum turned into a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground. I bolted, the artifact clutched in my hand. I ran back to the cabin with Bo barking wildly at my heels. Behind us, the thing in the wheat began to follow, its footsteps shaking the earth. But it moved wrong, sometimes too fast, sometimes stopping completely, like a film skipping frames. I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against the wood as the sound outside faded. Inside, Bo wouldn't settle. He paced the room, whining and growling at the windows. I set the artifact on the kitchen table, staring at it like it might move on its own. Walter's words echoed in my head. "You need to put it back, and you need to do it soon." The chanting outside stopped, replaced by a single, deliberate knock on the door. Then another. Then silence. I waited, shotgun in hand, sweat running down my back despite the cold. The knocking came again, this time from the window. Then the back door. Then all around the cabin at once, a thunderous drumming that made the walls shake and pictures fall from their hooks. "I know what you want," I shouted over the noise. "I'll put it back. First light, I'll put it back where I found it." The knocking stopped immediately. In the silence that followed, I heard breathing, wet and labored, just outside the door. Then that voice again, not my father's this time, but my own. "First light. We wait, we watch." I spent the rest of the night preparing. I dug through old boxes until I found my grandmother's rosary, though I hadn't prayed in years. I loaded every gun I owned and placed them around the cabin. I even nailed boards over the windows, though I knew they wouldn't stop whatever was out there. Bo stayed pressed against my leg, trembling but loyal. As dawn approached, I gathered my courage and the artifact. The leather pouch from Walter hung around my neck, and I whispered a prayer to God, to whoever might be listening. Outside, the wheat field stood perfectly still in the gray morning light, but I could feel them watching, waiting. The keeper, and whatever else lived in those fields. I made my way to the spot where I'd first found the artifact, my hands shaking as I dug into the cold earth. The hole was deeper than I remembered, and as I placed the metal object back into its resting place, the carvings seemed to pulse with a faint light. I covered it quickly, packing the dirt down hard, whispering apologies to the land, to whatever I'd disturbed. The wheat rustled once, a sound like a sigh of relief. Then silence returned to the farm, true silence this time. Bo's tail began to wag tentatively. The morning birds started their songs, but I knew things would never be quite the same. I'd seen what watches over this land, what waits in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the wheat stands tall, I still hear that chanting on the wind, reminding me that some things are meant to stay buried. I've been in this farmhouse my whole life, so nights out here usually feel familiar, almost comforting. You learn to tune out the usual creaks in the old wood, the distant lowing of cattle, and the soft chirping that drifts in through the windows. But that evening in early May, something put me on edge. It started as I was going through my usual end-of-day routine. My parents were visiting my sister 2 counties over, leaving me alone to manage the property for the week. The solitude never bothered me before. I'd spent countless nights by myself in this house, but tonight felt different somehow. The living room lamp clicked off, leaving the space a lot darker than I remembered. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and expectant. I headed to the front windows for my final pass, just to be sure everything was locked up tight. The farm spread out before me, bathed in pale moonlight that cast long shadows across the fields. Our cattle were dark shapes in the distance, most of them lying down for the night. I nearly convinced myself I was being paranoid when a faint glow caught my eye outside. At first, I thought I was imagining it. 2 spots of light hovered near the tree line, too high off the ground to be a stray cat or a fox. I blinked hard, squinting into the darkness. The spots remained, unmoving, fixed in place like twin stars fallen to earth. I took off my glasses, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. But they were gone. My brain scrambled to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe fireflies caught in a gust of wind, or a reflection of the moon on broken glass. Still, I made certain to lock every door and window before heading upstairs, my heart thumping a little harder than I'd care to admit. The floorboards protested beneath my weight as I climbed the stairs. Each room I passed seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper, more substantial somehow. When I finally reached my bedroom, I closed the door firmly behind me, something I rarely did. The night air felt unusually still, almost stagnant. Despite the open window, no breeze stirred the curtains. I didn't sleep well. Every sound from outside seemed amplified. Branches scraping against the siding, the distant call of an owl, the soft rustling of leaves. Each noise jolted me from the edge of sleep, leaving me staring wide-eyed at the ceiling, ears straining for something I couldn't name. Dawn arrived too fast, and I was already dragging myself out of bed to tend the animals. The morning light failed to dispel the unease that had settled over me during the night. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the fatigue that clung to me like a second skin. I hopped into my boots, stepped outside, and got hit with a stale, humid smell floating on the morning breeze. It felt wrong somehow, but I shoved that aside and focused on chores. The grass was wet with dew, soaking the hems of my jeans as I trudged toward the barn. My first stop was the barn. The horses were fine, just a bit restless. They shifted nervously in their stalls, ears flicking back and forth. When I approached with their feed, they snorted and shied away, eyes rolling. I'd never seen them so agitated. "Easy, easy," I murmured, holding out my hand. "What's got you all worked up this morning?" The real shock came when I checked on the cows. There were fewer than yesterday. I counted at least twice, but it didn't add up. 28 yesterday, 26 today, 2 missing. Maybe I miscounted before, or maybe some had wandered off. That's when I noticed the fence. What used to be a sturdy section was torn and sagging, like something big and strong had barreled right through it. Splintered wood jutted at weird angles. Barbed wire, which had been tightly strung just yesterday, hung in loose coils. I leaned in for a closer look and saw footprints in the dirt. They were strange, almost a hybrid shape. Part hoof, part something else entirely. Too large for a deer, too misshapen for a bear. My family's taught me all about local wildlife, yet these tracks didn't match anything I'd seen or heard about. The uneasy feeling I'd had the night before started creeping back, settling in the pit of my stomach like a cold stone. I knelt down, examining the prints more closely. They were deep, as if whatever made them carried significant weight. And there was something else. A faint, sour odor hung in the air around the damaged fence, reminiscent of spoiled meat. I checked the rest of the property, finding no other clues, so I tried to move on, patching the fence as best I could until I had help. The work was mindless enough, but my thoughts kept drifting back to those lights in the darkness, the missing cattle, the strange footprints. None of it made sense. As the day dragged on, I found it tough to focus. Every sound from the woods made me jump. My phone lit up with a text from my girlfriend, Mia. She wanted to know if we were still on for dinner that weekend. I started typing a response, but my mind wasn't in it. My message came out short, almost curt. She noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling, this nameless dread that had taken root inside me. I deflected, blaming my mood on lack of sleep and the pressure of managing the farm alone. The conversation blew up into a full-on fight. It left me tense and itching to clear my head. So after dusk, I grabbed my phone and headphones, heading off toward the forest. In retrospect, it was a stupid decision, but at the time, I just needed to get away from the house, from the damaged fence, from the memory of those gleaming eyes in the darkness. I've hiked through these woods 1,000 times, but this was different. The familiar paths seemed altered somehow, the trees closer together, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Something about the night air felt oppressive, like it was charged with static electricity. The hair on my arms stood on end despite the warmth of the evening. I cranked up my music to overpower my thoughts and wandered deeper than I intended. The heavy bass thrummed in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the forest. Time seemed to slip away from me as I walked, my feet carrying me forward without conscious thought. Before I knew it, darkness was everywhere. The sun had set completely, leaving only the faint glow of a quarter moon filtering through the canopy overhead. I stopped, suddenly aware of how far I'd come. The farmhouse was nowhere in sight. I flipped on my phone's flashlight, sweeping it around. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of underbrush and tree trunks. Shadows danced and shifted with each movement of my hand. I caught the reflection of something that looked like eyes in the beam, high behind a tree. Not animal eyes, too tall, too stationary. As soon as I angled my phone that way, the reflection vanished, leaving me reeling from a rush of panic. Maybe it was a trick of the light again, or maybe not. I pulled out my earbuds, suddenly desperate to hear what might be around me. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No insects chirping, no rustling of nocturnal creatures, just heavy, waiting silence. A growl rippled through the trees, low and ragged, unlike anything I'd heard in these woods. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. I'd heard those before. This was deeper, almost guttural, with an odd wet quality to it that made my skin crawl. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I realized I had no clue where the path went. Shadows seemed to shift and move at the corners of my vision. My flashlight beam trembled as my hand began to shake. I started to backtrack, stumbling over roots and tangling my boots in undergrowth. My flashlight shook with each step, casting wild patterns across the forest floor. Every tree, every bush seemed to conceal some nameless threat. The darkness pressed in, thick as smoke. Then a sharp snap, like a branch being crushed underfoot, sounded close. Too close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound had come from somewhere to my left, just beyond the reach of my light. Fear surged in my chest, hot and urgent. I had to get out. My jog turned into a full-on sprint, branches slapping my face and arms. Thorns tore at my clothes, but I barely felt the sting. All I could focus on was moving forward, getting away from whatever lurked in the shadows behind me. I could hear it now. Something large crashing through the underbrush, keeping pace with me. It moved with a strange, loping gait, sometimes on all fours, sometimes upright. The sound of its pursuit drove me faster, my lungs burning with each gasping breath. When I finally saw the farmhouse lights in the distance, I breathed a silent prayer of relief. The fields stretched out before me, open and exposed in the moonlight. I burst from the tree line, legs pumping desperately. I hopped the broken fence, nearly face-planting on the other side. My foot caught on a loose wire, sending me sprawling into the dirt. I scrambled up immediately, whirling around to face the woods. Something moved at the tree line, tall, menacing, with eyes that gleamed faintly in the dark. It stood partially obscured by the shadows, but I could make out a vague silhouette, large, hunched, with what looked like antlers or horns jutting from its head. A vile odor hit me, intense enough to make me gag. The smell of decay, of things long dead and rotting in the summer heat. It never advanced. It just stood there, watching with a stillness that felt deliberate, like it was studying me. I forced myself inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My heart hammered as I peeked out a window, only to glimpse that pair of eyes still trained on me. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared, fixed on the house like twin beacons. Enough was enough. I yanked the blinds down, shut off every light, and made my way to my room, grabbing the old shotgun from my closet just to steady my nerves. It was my grandfather's, a Remington pump action that I'd learned to shoot when I was 12. I checked the chamber, loaded it, and sat on the edge of my bed, the cold metal a reassuring weight in my hands. That night, sleep was a distant thing. My thoughts were in a whirl, cows disappearing, fences torn, footprints with no reasonable explanation, and a hulking silhouette crouched at the edge of my land. I tried to convince myself I'd wake up and find a neat explanation, but I knew, deep down, that something big and unknown was stalking these woods. I woke the next morning with the shotgun still clutched in my arms, feeling like I'd only dozed off in brief intervals. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting warm rectangles on the floor. Birds chirped outside, their cheerful sounds at odds with the dread that still coiled inside me. The sun was out, but it did nothing to chase off the weight tightening my chest. I dragged myself outside to survey the damage, shotgun in hand. The day was bright and clear, the sky a perfect blue without a cloud in sight. It should have been beautiful. Sure enough, another cow was gone. The fencing I'd patched was shredded again, worse than before. Where yesterday's damage had been limited to a small section, now a full 10 feet of fence was destroyed. Splinters littered the ground, and I spotted crimson smears on the wire that looked too fresh to be old stains. There were footprints, too, the kind I had no name for. Long, deformed impressions that seemed part hoof, part something far more disturbing. Some looked almost human, 5 toes splayed wide, while others resembled a deer's print, only larger, deeper, wrong somehow. I knelt down to examine one particularly clear impression. The soil had retained its shape perfectly, allowing me to see details I'd missed yesterday. What I had taken for a hoof print had a thumb-like appendage on one side, as if the creature's feet were caught in some halfway state between animal and human. I forced myself deeper into the pasture, shotgun ready. It felt ridiculous in the bright morning light. Monsters didn't exist, at least not the kind that hid in forests and stole cattle in the night. But every rustle in the grass, every flutter of a bird made me jump, my finger tightening on the trigger guard. The remaining cattle huddled together at the far end of the field, as far from the woods as they could get. They watched me approach with wide, frightened eyes. When I tried to herd them toward the barn for safety, they balked, refusing to move closer to the tree line. The forest stood ominously just beyond the fields, an unspoken invitation for this thing to come and go at will. Dark and dense, it seemed to swallow the sunlight that touched its edges. Despite the daylight, I sensed I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched crawled up my spine, settling between my shoulder blades like an icy finger. Frustration and anger flared inside me. I'd lived here all my life, and no unknown creature was going to claim this land as a feeding ground. I mustered enough nerve to stand at the tree line, hollering into the undergrowth that I wasn't afraid. "I know you're in there," I shouted, my voice echoing back at me from the silent trees. "This is my land, my home. You're not welcome here." My voice shook, and the echo that returned from the stillness was unnerving. For a split second, I thought I saw a black shape slip between the trunks, but whether it was the thing itself or just my imagination, I had no intention of finding out. I half-jogged back to the farmhouse, all the while feeling that same prickling sense of being watched. The weight of unseen eyes followed me across the field, up the porch steps, through the door. Even inside with locks engaged and curtains drawn, I couldn't shake the feeling of exposure, of vulnerability. I called the local sheriff's office, reporting the missing cattle and the damaged fence. The deputy who answered sounded bored, telling me that cattle rustling wasn't uncommon and promising to send someone out when they had the manpower. I didn't mention the strange tracks or the creature I'd glimpsed. They'd think I was crazy, or worse, playing a prank. I tried calling Mia next, hoping to apologize for our fight. But the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking her to call me back, careful to keep my voice steady, not wanting to alarm her with the fear that still thrummed through my veins. That afternoon, I did everything I could think of to prepare. I scavenged the barn for nails, boards, and tools, then rigged makeshift barricades on the windows. It felt a little excessive, but the memory of those eyes peering at me the night before kept me hammering away. I boarded up the first-floor windows, leaving just enough space to peek through or aim a gun if necessary. I dragged the heavy oak table from the dining room to brace against the back door, which had always been flimsy. I stacked furniture against certain doors I never used, bracing them from the inside. The place looked more like a fortress with each passing hour, and I hated that I needed this level of security in my own home. But the alternative, being exposed, vulnerable to whatever stalked the woods, was worse. I inventoried our weapons next. Besides the shotgun, there was my father's hunting rifle and a small revolver he kept locked in the safe. I retrieved all three, along with every box of ammunition I could find. I laid them out on the kitchen counter, checking each one methodically. My phone rang as I was loading the revolver. It was Mia, returning my call. I almost didn't answer, unsure of what to say, how to explain what was happening without sounding unhinged, but I needed to hear a friendly voice. "Hey," I said, trying to sound normal. "Are you okay?" she asked immediately. "You sounded weird in your message." I hesitated. "I'm fine. Just dealing with some issues at the farm." "What kind of issues?" "Something's been attacking the cattle," I said, deciding to stick as close to the truth as possible. "Broke through the fence twice now. Took 3 of them." "God, that's awful. What was it? A bear?" I closed my eyes, seeing again the misshapen tracks, the gleaming eyes in the darkness. "I don't know. Maybe." There was a pause. "Do you want me to come over? I could be there in an hour." "No," I said too quickly. The thought of Mia here exposed to whatever danger lurked in the woods made my stomach twist. "No, it's fine. I've got it under control. Just wanted to say sorry about yesterday." We talked for a few more minutes, but my attention was divided. My eyes constantly drawn to the windows, the darkening sky outside. When we finally hung up, I felt both relieved and more alone than ever. As dusk crept closer, I patrolled the house again, triple-checking every lock, every barricade. The air outside turned heavy, and the wind rustled the dead leaves near the fence. It carried a faint, sickly smell that made my stomach churn. I couldn't shake the sense that it was out there, sizing me up, waiting for darkness to hide its advance. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the tree line, searching for those twin points of light, that hulking silhouette. With the last of the daylight fading, I made one final trip to the barn, determined to save as many of the animals as possible. I managed to herd most of the cattle into the sturdy structure, securing the heavy doors with chains and padlocks. The horses were already inside, nervously pawing at the ground in their stalls. As I walked back to the house, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the farm into twilight. Shadows stretched long across the fields, reaching toward me like grasping hands. I quickened my pace, suddenly desperate to be inside, behind locked doors and barricaded windows. I made it to the porch just as full darkness descended. The night air was unnaturally still, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting. I took one last look around before stepping inside, locking and barricading the door behind me. Night finally fell, and with it, the usual forest noises vanished. No crickets, no frogs, just an unsettling quiet that set me on edge. My muscles tensed with every step across the old floorboards. I turned off most of the lights, leaving a few dim lamps so I could see if anything moved outside. My shotgun was within arm's reach, and I had the revolver holstered at my hip just in case. I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of both the front door and the large picture window that overlooked the yard. From here I could see most of the property, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. A few hours crawled by in suffocating silence. The house creaked and settled around me, each sound making me flinch. My eyes burned from staring into the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd overdone it. That the missing cattle had a mundane explanation, that the tracks belonged to some known animal, distorted by my fear and the poor light. That the shape I'd seen at the tree line was nothing more than a shadow, a trick of the moonlight. That's when a sudden crash rattled the front door. The force behind the blow echoed through the house, making the windows vibrate in their frames. My mouth went dry and my heart thundered in my ears. I raised the shotgun, aiming it at the door, my palms slick with sweat. Another crash. The doorframe quaked, and I heard glass pop and skitter across the floor somewhere downstairs. The barricade I'd built shuddered but held firm. Whatever was outside wanted in, and it was strong enough to make solid oak bend. A low roar rose from behind the walls, so feral and strange that I felt the vibrations in my chest. It wasn't a sound any natural animal could make, too deep, too resonant, with an almost human quality that made it all the more terrifying. I backed away from the door, moving deeper into the house. The crashing continued, moving from the front door to the windows. I heard glass shatter in the kitchen, followed by the scrape of something large forcing its way through the opening. Something was forcing its way in, and my body reacted before my brain caught up. I snatched the shotgun and scrambled upstairs, nearly tripping on the last step. In the hallway, I could hear it moving below, heavy footsteps that made the floorboards groan in protest. Each footstep of the intruder felt heavier than any human's. The boards creaked as if under the weight of something colossal. An overpowering stench drifted toward me, thick enough to taste. The reek of decay, of flesh left too long in the sun. I covered my nose with my sleeve, trying not to retch. The smell was so intense it made my eyes water. I backed into my bedroom, closing the door as quietly as possible. My hands shook as I turned the lock, knowing it would offer little protection against whatever had broken into my home. Then came the banging on the door to my room. Loud, rhythmic hits that shattered my nerve. It knew exactly where I was. I could hear it breathing on the other side of the door, wet, ragged breaths that sounded more like liquid bubbling than air moving through lungs. Splinters of wood flew as I shouldered the door, shoving a dresser into place to buy a few seconds. The heavy piece of furniture moved reluctantly across the floor, scraping loudly. I positioned it against the door just as something slammed into it from the other side. The door buckled, and I finally caught sight of it. The crack between the door and frame gave me a horrible glimpse. Matted fur, something like a deer's skull topped with twisted antlers, but with patches of rotting skin clinging to it. The antlers were wrong, too many points, growing in impossible directions, some curling back toward the skull. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. They weren't in the skull where they should be, but lower, embedded in the decaying flesh of what might have been a neck. They glowed with a sickly yellow light, pupilless and fixed directly on me. My hands shook as I racked the shotgun's first shell. I aimed at the gap in the door, my finger tightening on the trigger. The creature slammed into the door again, splintering the wood. The dresser slid back several inches, its legs leaving deep gouges in the hardwood floor. I fired. The muzzle flash lit up the creature's hideous features. Empty eyes set in decaying sockets, an open maw with a jaw that seemed off-kilter, lined with teeth too numerous and too sharp to belong to any deer. The shot caught it in what passed for its chest. It let out a horrible screech that made me recoil, then lunged with renewed fury. The door burst open, sending shards of wood everywhere, the dresser toppling backward. The thing stood fully revealed now, its form defying comprehension. It walked on two legs, but they bent at odd angles, ending in split hooves that had partially morphed into something like human feet. Its arms were too long, hanging almost to the floor, tipped with curved claws that looked capable of tearing through flesh with ease. Its torso was a nightmare of exposed bone and rotting meat, ribs jutting through patchy fur, and the smell. God, the smell was overwhelming, like standing in the middle of a mass grave in the height of summer. I fired again, the recoil slamming back into my shoulder, but I refused to let go. The thing staggered, leaking a dark, foul substance that smelled like death. It howled, flailing those long limbs in fury. I kept my finger on the trigger, racking another shell, firing and doing it again until I was spent. Each shot was deafening, and the house trembled with every roar from that abomination. The creature's movements became erratic. It slammed into walls, leaving smears of that black ichor wherever it touched. It seemed confused, disoriented by the assault. I used the moment to reload, my fingers fumbling with the shells. Finally, it staggered backward, wheeling around in confusion. It tore down part of the hallway as it fled, smashing through walls and overturning furniture in its escape. I grabbed my pistol, sprinting after it down the stairs, driven by a mix of terror and rage. My heart hammered, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The front door, the very one it had battered in, now stood ripped off its hinges. Outside, the shape lumbered across the yard. Its outline was monstrous, lit by a flickering porch light. With a trembling grip, I squeezed off a few rounds. The bullet seemed to do little more than anger it further. It whipped its head back, unleashing a final roar that reverberated off the barn, then bounded into the forest shadows. I wanted to chase it, to finish it off, to ensure it never returned. But the rational side of me knew that was suicide. I stood on the porch, watching it disappear between the looming trees, its form blending with the darkness until it was gone. I called out a string of curses, equal parts terrified and furious, watching it vanish between the looming trees. Then there was sudden silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. Even the wind had died, leaving the yard unnaturally still. My front door was on the ground, the hinges twisted beyond repair. Inside, I discovered the windows, where I swore I'd heard glass explode, were strangely intact, as if reality had split for a moment, and then stitched itself back together, leaving evidence only in the wrecked wood and bullet casings scattered at my feet. I leaned against the splintered frame, shotgun and pistol hanging limply in my hands, trying to piece everything together. What had just happened? What was that thing? And most importantly, would it come back? I stayed that way for what felt like hours, until I realized I had to come up with a believable story for my parents. There was no way to explain giant claw marks or bullet holes that made any sense. I finally decided to say I'd lost my temper during a personal crisis, blowing holes in the door myself. A story that wouldn't earn me any points, but at least it wouldn't brand me a lunatic. The rest of the night passed in a blur of activity. I swept up broken glass, nailed plywood over the gaping hole where the front door had been, and tried to clean the black ichor that stained the floors and walls. It resisted my efforts, seeming to cling to the surfaces it touched, leaving permanent marks like acid burns. I didn't sleep. I couldn't, not with the memory of that thing so fresh in my mind. Instead, I sat on the porch until dawn, weapons at the ready, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Morning came with surprising normalcy. Birds sang in the trees, sunlight dappled the yard, and a gentle breeze stirred the grass. It was hard to reconcile the peaceful scene before me with the horror of the previous night. I forced myself to inspect the property in daylight. The barn was untouched, the animals inside unharmed, but the yard told a different story. Deep gouges marred the earth where the creature had fled, leading in a straight line toward the forest. I followed them to the edge of the trees, but no further. I couldn't bring myself to enter those woods again. The black substance it had leaked was still visible, glistening wetly in the morning sun despite the hours that had passed. When I touched it with a stick, the wood sizzled and smoked, confirming my suspicion that it was corrosive. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but the house and yard were eerily calm. Stains on the floor had vanished where I'd cleaned, though the gouges remained. The only real reminder of the battle was my ruined door and the crippling weight in my chest. The phone rang soon after, my folks checking up on me. I lied as smoothly as I could about the door, blaming it on a fit of anger over my fight with Mia. I promised to fix it before they got home. They threatened to ground me for the rest of my life, but that was a relief compared to explaining the truth. The next few days passed without incident. No more cattle disappeared. No more strange lights appeared at the edge of the woods. But the uneasy feeling never left me. I slept in short bursts, always with a weapon close at hand. I avoided the forest entirely, taking the long way around to reach the fields on the other side. When my parents returned, they were furious about the door and the holes in the walls, but their anger was nothing compared to the terror I'd felt. I accepted their punishment without complaint, relieved that they were home, that I wasn't alone anymore. I never told them what had happened. How could I? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. So I kept it to myself, carrying the weight of that night alone. The summer passed and fall arrived. The incident began to feel distant, dreamlike. I started to wonder if I'd imagined it all, the eyes in the darkness, the creature in my bedroom. Maybe I'd had some kind of breakdown, conjured a monster from my own fear and isolation. But then I'd catch a glimpse of those black stains on the hallway wall, resistant to paint and bleach alike. Or I'd hear something moving in the woods at night, something too large to be a deer, too deliberate to be a bear. And I'd know it was real, all of it. Time marched on, and I eventually left for college, grateful for the distance from the farm and the woods that surrounded it. My dorm room in the city felt safe, surrounded by concrete and streetlights, far from the darkness of those trees. But every so often I'd check in with my family, ask if the cows were all accounted for, if the fences were intact, if they'd heard any strange howls in the night. They'd brush it off as me worrying too much. But they didn't know the whole story. 3 years passed. I was home for winter break, the farm blanketed in snow. The woods looked different in winter, stark, skeletal, less threatening somehow. I'd almost convinced myself that what happened that summer was some kind of hallucination, a product of stress and isolation. Until the night I heard it again, that low, guttural growl that had haunted my dreams for years. I was alone in the house, my parents at a neighbor's Christmas party. The sound came from outside, somewhere near the barn. My old fear returned in an instant, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I reached for the shotgun I knew was still in the closet, checking that it was loaded with trembling hands. I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The yard was illuminated by the security light my father had installed, casting everything in a harsh, white glow. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then movement caught my eye, a shadow detaching itself from the tree line, moving with that same odd, loping gait toward the barn. It was back. Or maybe it had never left, simply biding its time, waiting for me to return. I had a choice to make. I could stay inside, barricade the doors like before, hope it left without causing damage. Or I could confront it, finish what had started 3 years ago. The decision was made for me when I heard the horses scream in terror. Their panicked whinnies cut through the night, spurring me into action. I couldn't let it hurt them. I pulled on my boots and coat, grabbed the shotgun, and stepped out into the cold night air. Snow crunched beneath my feet as I moved toward the barn, each breath visible in the frigid air. The security light cast my shadow long before me, a dark shape stretching across the pristine white ground. The barn door stood open, swinging gently in the breeze. I hadn't left it that way. Something had forced it open, breaking the heavy padlock my father used to secure it. The metal lay twisted in the snow, bent as if it were made of soft clay. I raised the shotgun, moving cautiously toward the opening. The horse's frightened noises had stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence that set my teeth on edge. I could smell it. That same putrid stench that had filled my bedroom 3 years ago. "I know you're in there," I called, my voice steadier than I felt. "Come out and face me." No response, just that heavy, waiting silence. I took another step forward, my finger tightening on the trigger. The barn's interior was dark, the shadows deep and impenetrable. Then I saw them, those eyes, glowing with that same sickly yellow light. They were higher this time, as if the creature had grown. They fixed on me with an intelligence that was unmistakable, calculating, almost human. It emerged from the darkness slowly, deliberately. It had changed. Where before it had seemed cobbled together, a mishmash of deer and human parts, now it moved with a terrible grace, its form more defined, more purposeful. The antlers had grown, spreading outward in a crown of bone that scraped the top of the barn door. Its body was larger, the muscle more pronounced beneath the patchy fur. But the face was the same, that deer skull with rotting flesh clinging to it, those eyes burning from what should have been its neck. It stood there, regarding me with what felt like recognition. Did it remember me? Remember the wounds I'd inflicted? I raised the shotgun higher, aiming for those glowing eyes. "Get off my land," I said, my voice low and threatening. "You don't belong here." The creature tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture that made my skin crawl. Then it made a sound, not a growl or roar, but something closer to laughter, a wet, gurgling noise that echoed through the barn. It took a step forward, its misshapen feet leaving steaming prints in the snow. Another step, then another. Each movement deliberate, testing me, challenging me. I fired. The shot echoed across the silent farm, louder somehow in the winter air. The creature jerked as the buckshot tore into its shoulder, that black ichor spraying from the wound. But it didn't fall. It didn't even slow down. Instead, it charged. I barely had time to rack another shell before it was on me, those impossibly long arms reaching out. I fired again, point blank into what passed for its chest. The impact knocked it back a step, giving me just enough time to turn and run. My boots slipped in the snow as I sprinted toward the house, the creature's rasping breath close behind me. I could feel its presence at my back, a wall of fetid air and malevolent intent. The distance to the porch seemed impossible, stretching out before me like a nightmare. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. It was gaining on me, moving with that strange, bounding gait that ate up the ground between us. Its mouth was open, revealing row upon row of needle-like teeth, glistening wetly in the security light. I made it to the porch steps, taking them 2 at a time. My hand fumbled with the doorknob, slick with sweat despite the cold. The door swung open, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I heard the thud as the creature slammed into the door, making the whole frame shudder. The lock wouldn't hold it for long. I'd seen what it could do to solid oak. I needed a plan, a weapon, anything. My eyes fell on the cabinet where my father kept his hunting gear. Inside was his deer rifle, a .30-06 with more stopping power than my shotgun. I grabbed it, checking that it was loaded, then positioned myself at the living room window with a clear view of the porch. The creature was there, pacing back and forth, its movements jerky and agitated. It paused, raising its antlered head to sniff the air. Then it turned those burning eyes directly to where I stood, as if it could see through walls, through darkness, straight into me. I raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel at its chest. My finger tightened on the trigger. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The creature staggered backward, black fluid erupting from a hole in its chest. It howled, a sound of rage and pain that made the windows rattle. I worked the bolt, chambering another round, and fired again. This time, the shot caught it in the head, just below one of those glowing eyes. The impact spun it halfway around, sending it crashing into the porch railing. It lay there, twitching, that black ichor pooling beneath it. I watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the movement slowed and then stopped. The yellow light in its eyes flickered like dying bulbs, then went dark. For several long minutes I stood frozen at the window, rifle still raised, waiting for it to move again. It didn't. The only movement was the slow spread of black fluid across the white snow, eating through it like acid, revealing the dark earth beneath. I should have felt relief. Instead, a new kind of dread settled over me. What if there were more? What if this was just one of many? The forest suddenly seemed vast and full of hidden threats, creatures waiting in the darkness, watching. When my parents returned home hours later, they found me still standing at the window, rifle in hand. The porch was empty. No creature, no black ichor, not even footprints in the snow. Just pristine whiteness, unmarked and innocent. They thought I was having some kind of episode, triggered by being home again. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't know what lurked in the woods. Spring came early that year. I should have been back at college, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not when I knew it was still out there. The creature I'd shot on the porch had vanished without a trace, but I knew that didn't mean it was gone for good. My parents worried about me. They spoke in hushed tones when they thought I couldn't hear, using words like counseling and break from school. They didn't understand why I insisted on patrolling the property each night, why I kept weapons close at hand, why I never set foot in the forest. I tried to explain once, to tell them about that summer night 3 years ago, about the creature that had broken into our home. They listened with concerned expressions, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. They didn't believe me. No one did. Except Mia. When she came to visit that spring, I finally told her everything. I expected disbelief, maybe even laughter. Instead, she listened quietly, her face growing more serious with each detail. "I believe you," she said when I finished. "You do?" She nodded, her eyes troubled. "My grandfather used to tell stories about something in these woods, something that wasn't natural. The old-timers called it the Wendigo." The name sent a chill through me. What's a Wendigo? In the old stories, it's a spirit that possesses humans who've committed certain sins, like cannibalism. It transforms them into monsters trapped between human and beast. She hesitated. Grandpa said they were immortal, that they could only be killed by fire. Fire. The one thing I hadn't tried. That night, Mia stayed over. We sat on the porch watching the tree line as darkness fell. The spring air was warm, fragrant with new growth and possibility. But my attention was fixed on the shadows between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. "Do you really think it's still out there?" Mia asked, her voice hushed. I nodded, not taking my eyes off the forest. "I know it is. I can feel it watching us." "What are you going to do?" I'd been asking myself the same question for months. Running wasn't an option. It would just follow me, or worse, turn its attention to my family in my absence. Hiding was temporary at best. There was only one solution. "I'm going to hunt it down," I said. "End this once and for all." Mia's hand found mine in the darkness. "Not alone, you're not." We spent the next week preparing. I showed Mia how to use the shotgun, the rifle, the revolver. We gathered supplies, flashlights, knives, first aid kits. And we made Molotov cocktails, glass bottles filled with gasoline, rags stuffed in the necks as wicks. My parents thought we were crazy, heading into the woods at night with weapons and homemade incendiaries. They tried to stop us, threatened to call the sheriff. But in the end, they let us go, perhaps hoping that finding nothing would finally cure me of my obsession. We set out at dusk, the light fading rapidly as we entered the forest. The familiar paths seemed even more sinister now, the trees looming overhead like silent watchers. Mia walked close beside me, her shotgun ready, eyes scanning the darkening woods. "Where are we going?" she whispered. I pointed deeper into the forest. "There's an old hunting cabin about 2 miles in. My grandfather used to use it. If anything lives in these woods, it would know about that cabin." We moved as quietly as possible, pausing often to listen for any sound out of place. The forest was alive with normal nighttime noises: crickets chirping, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. But nothing unusual, nothing to suggest we weren't alone. The cabin appeared ahead, a dark shape against the night sky. It was small, little more than a shack really, with one room and a tiny porch. The door hung crooked on its hinges, the windows dark and empty. "Wait here," I told Mia, stepping forward to check the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness inside. The cabin was empty, dust covering the single table and chair, the narrow cot against one wall. No one had been here in years. Or so it seemed at first glance. Then my light caught something on the floor. Tracks, pressed into the dust. Not human footprints, not animal tracks, but those same hybrid shapes I'd seen at the fence line. And they were fresh. I backed out of the cabin slowly, keeping my light trained on the doorway. "It's been here," I whispered to Mia. "Recently." Her face paled in the moonlight. "What do we do?" Before I could answer, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind us. We both whirled around, weapons raised. Nothing moved among the trees, but the night had gone suddenly, deathly quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no animal sounds at all. Just that heavy, waiting silence I'd come to associate with the creature's presence. "It's here," I breathed, barely audible even to myself. As if in response, a low growl emerged from the darkness to our right. We turned toward the sound, and there they were. Those yellow eyes, floating in the blackness between the trees. "Don't move," I whispered to Mia. "Let it come to us." The creature stepped forward, moving into a patch of moonlight. It was even more horrifying than I remembered. The antlers had continued to grow, branching and twisting into an impossible crown. Its body was larger, more muscular, the decay seemingly halted or reversed. And its face, that deer skull with rotting flesh, had changed, becoming more expressive, more human somehow. It regarded us with what looked like curiosity, those burning eyes moving from me to Mia and back again. It showed no fear, no hesitation, just that terrible, patient intelligence. "Now," I said, loud enough for Mia to hear. We fired together, the shotgun and rifle roaring in unison. The creature jerked as the bullet struck, black ichor spraying from its chest and shoulder. But it didn't fall. Instead, it charged, moving with shocking speed for something so large. I dropped the rifle, grabbing one of the Molotov cocktails from my backpack. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lighter, trying to ignite the ragwick. The creature was closing fast, those terrible claws extended. The wick caught just as it reached us. I hurled the bottle with all my strength, watching it arc through the air and smash against the creature's chest. Flames erupted instantly, engulfing its upper body in a sheet of fire. The creature's scream was like nothing I'd ever heard. A high, piercing wail that seemed to contain centuries of rage and pain. It thrashed wildly, trying to extinguish the flames, but the fire spread rapidly, consuming fur and flesh alike. Mia and I backed away, watching in horror and fascination as the creature burned. The smell was unbearable, a mix of gasoline, charred meat, and something older, more putrid. The yellow light in its eyes flickered, dimmed, then flared brighter than before, like twin stars going supernova. Then, with one final, earth-shaking roar, it collapsed to the ground, still burning. The flames illuminated the clearing, casting long, dancing shadows among the trees. We stood there, watching as the fire consumed what remained of the creature, reducing it to ash and bone. When it was over, when the last flames had died down, leaving only smoldering remains, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was done. The nightmare that had haunted me for years was finally over. Mia's hand found mine, squeezing tight. "Is it really dead?" I nodded, staring at the blackened shape on the forest floor. "It has to be." We didn't linger. The fire had attracted attention. We could hear voices in the distance, see flashlight beams moving through the trees. The local fire department probably, responding to reports of smoke in the forest. We slipped away, taking a different path back to the farm. Neither of us spoke until we were clear of the woods, the open fields spreading before us under the moonlight. "What do we tell people?" Mia asked as we walked. I shook my head. "Nothing. No one would believe us anyway." She didn't argue. She knew as well as I did that some truths are better kept hidden, some experiences too strange to share. We reached the farmhouse just before dawn, exhausted but alive. My parents were waiting, worry etched on their faces. They asked questions we couldn't answer, made demands we couldn't meet. In the end, we told them what they wanted to hear, that we'd found nothing, that the woods were empty, that my fears were unfounded. It was easier that way, for them at least. In the weeks that followed, life returned to something resembling normal. I went back to college, throwing myself into my studies with newfound focus. Mia and I grew closer, bound by the secret we shared. And if sometimes I woke in the night, heart racing, convinced I could hear that low, guttural growl outside my window, well, that was to be expected. Some fears don't die easily. Years have passed since that night in the forest. I've graduated, started a career, moved to a city far from those woods. But I still check in with my family regularly, ask if all the cattle are accounted for, if the fences are intact, if they've heard any strange sounds in the night. They brush it off as me worrying too much. But they don't know the whole story. They don't know what I know. That some things refuse to stay dead. That some nightmares find ways to return. Part of me stayed convinced that whatever I fought off that night is still out there, licking its wounds, waiting. And the thought of going back to that farm alone still manages to send a sharp bolt of dread through my gut every time, because deep down I know the truth. The forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes in the darkest part of the night, those secrets find ways to break free. My name is William Johnson, and I am 65 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on October 14th, 2003, when I was 44. It's a story I've kept to myself for over 2 decades, but now, as I approach my twilight years, I feel compelled to share it. Perhaps as a warning, or maybe just to unburden myself of a secret that's weighed heavily on my conscience for far too long. Back in 2003, I was working as a senior accountant for a large firm in Denver. The job paid well, but the stress was slowly killing me. 60-hour work weeks, endless meetings, and the constant pressure of deadlines had taken their toll. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, the tightness in my chest. My doctor had warned me about high blood pressure, suggesting I take some time off to relax. So, when October rolled around, I decided to take his advice. I had 3 weeks of unused vacation time, and I was determined to make the most of it. I needed to get away from the city, away from the noise and the crowds. I needed peace and quiet, and I knew just where to find it. Pinedale, Wyoming. Not many folks know about Pinedale, but it's a quiet place with some great spots for camping and fishing. I'd been there a few times before, always promising myself I'd come back for a longer stay. Now seemed like the perfect opportunity. I packed up my RV, a 28-foot Winnebago I'd bought a few years back but rarely used. I stocked it with enough food and supplies to last me the full 3 weeks, including my fishing gear and a few good books. As I pulled out of my driveway in the early hours of October 12th, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. The drive from Denver to Pinedale takes about 7 hours, but I was in no hurry. I took my time, enjoying the changing landscape as I headed north. The bustling suburbs gave way to rolling plains, which eventually transformed into the rugged beauty of Wyoming. As I crossed the state line, I could feel the tension starting to melt away. I arrived in Pinedale late in the afternoon of October 13th. The town was just as I remembered it, small, quiet, with a main street that looked like it belonged in another era. I stopped at the local grocery store to pick up a few last-minute items and chatted with the cashier, a friendly older woman named Martha. "Heading up to the lake?" she asked as she rang up my purchases. I nodded. "Fremont Lake. Thought I'd do some fishing, get away from it all for a while." Martha smiled, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of... what? Concern? Worry? But it was gone so quickly I thought I must have imagined it. "Well, you have a good time up there," she said, handing me my bags. "And be careful. The woods can be tricky this time of year." I thanked her and headed back to my RV, puzzling over her words. I'd been an outdoorsman all my life. Hunting, fishing, you name it. My dad had taken me out into the woods when I was just a kid, taught me how to track deer and catch trout. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness. Still, there was something about Martha's warning that stuck with me. As I drove out of town towards Fremont Lake, I pushed the thought aside. I was here to relax, not to worry about vague warnings from locals who probably thought any city folk were helpless in the woods. It was nearly dark by the time I found a secluded spot by the lake. The place was perfect. The water was still, reflecting the fading light like a mirror. The surrounding pine trees stood tall and silent, guardians of this peaceful sanctuary. I could already feel a sense of calm washing over me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in far too long. I set up my RV, got a small fire going, and cracked open a beer. As I sat there watching the stars come out one by one, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The cool mountain air filled my lungs, carrying with it the scent of pine and wood smoke. In the distance, an owl hooted softly. "This," I said to myself, raising my beer in a silent toast, "is exactly what I needed." Little did I know, as I drifted off to sleep that night, that my peaceful getaway was about to turn into something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The next morning, October 14th, I woke up just as the sun was peeking over the eastern mountains. The lake was shrouded in a light mist that slowly dissipated as the day warmed up. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat outside the RV, watching the world come to life around me. A pair of deer emerged from the tree line, cautiously making their way to the water's edge for a morning drink. A fish jumped in the lake, creating ripples that spread out in perfect concentric circles. The air was filled with the songs of various birds, the sharp cry of a blue jay, the melodious warble of a robin, the rat-a-tat of a woodpecker hard at work. After breakfast, I grabbed my fishing gear and headed down to the lake. I'd brought my favorite rod, a custom-made graphite beauty that had seen me through many a fishing trip. I baited my hook with a fat night crawler and cast my line into the still waters of Fremont Lake. Fishing, for me, has always been more about the experience than the catch. Don't get me wrong. I love the thrill of feeling a fish on the line, the battle to reel it in. But there's something magical about just sitting there, surrounded by nature, with nothing to do but wait and think. And think I did. About my job back in Denver, about the stress and the long hours. About my family, my wife Sarah, who had passed away 5 years ago from cancer, and our daughter Emily, now grown and living in California with her husband and 2 kids. I thought about the path my life had taken, the choices I'd made, the regrets I carried. Before I knew it, the sun was high in the sky, and my stomach was growling. I'd caught a couple of decent-sized trout, which I cleaned and cooked over the fire for lunch. As I sat there, savoring the fresh fish and the quiet of the forest, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The afternoon was spent hiking. I found a well-worn deer trail leading away from the lake and into the dense forest. The path wound its way up into the foothills, offering breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape. The autumn colors were in full display, reds, oranges, and golds, painting the hillsides in a riot of color. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to camp. I built up the fire, opened another beer, and settled in with one of the books I'd brought along. A dog-eared copy of Jack London's The Call of the Wild. The irony of reading about the Yukon wilderness while sitting in the Wyoming wilderness wasn't lost on me. That night, as I lay in my RV listening to the gentle lapping of the lake and the soft whisper of wind through the pines, I felt truly content. This, I thought, is what life should be about. Not the endless grind of work and responsibility, but moments of quiet beauty and reflection. The next day followed a similar pattern. Fishing in the morning, hiking in the afternoon, reading by the fire in the evening. I explored more of the surrounding area, discovering hidden meadows bursting with late-blooming wildflowers and rocky outcroppings that offered panoramic views of the lake and beyond. It was on one of these hikes that I first noticed something odd. I had paused to catch my breath on a steep section of the trail when I realized the forest had gone quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an eerie, oppressive silence. A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. I felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the trees around me. Nothing seemed out of place, but the silence persisted. After a few tense moments, I heard a twig snap somewhere in the distance. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. And then, as suddenly as it had fallen, the silence lifted. Birds resumed their songs. A squirrel chattered angrily from a nearby tree. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Get a grip, old man," I muttered to myself. "You're letting your imagination run wild." I made my way back to camp, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. That night, as I sat by the fire, I found myself glancing more frequently at the dark line of trees surrounding my campsite. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, it was filled with unsettling dreams of dark shapes moving just beyond the edge of my vision. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of the terror that awaited me in the seemingly peaceful woods of Fremont Lake. I woke on the third day feeling groggy and unsettled, the vague memory of unsettling dreams clinging to the edges of my consciousness. The morning was overcast, a blanket of gray clouds obscuring the sun and casting a gloomy pallor over the landscape. It matched my mood perfectly. After a quick breakfast and a strong cup of coffee, I decided to go fishing again, hoping the familiar routine would help shake off the lingering unease from the night before. I made my way down to the lake, noting absently that the usual morning chorus of birdsong was oddly muted. As I cast my line into the still waters of Fremont Lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The lake, which had seemed so peaceful and inviting just days before, now felt oppressive and somehow threatening. The surface was like glass, unbroken by the jump of fish or the ripples of a breeze. And the silence was deafening. It was then that I realized what was wrong. There were no birds, not a single chirp or call. The trees surrounding the lake stood silent sentinels, their branches empty of the usual flutter and movement of wildlife. A shiver ran down my spine despite the mild temperature. I reeled in my line, suddenly eager to be away from the quiet, watching lake. As I packed up my gear, I tried to rationalize the absence of birds. Perhaps they had simply flown south for the winter, I thought. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was too early, too sudden for such a mass migration. Determined to distract myself from these unsettling thoughts, I decided to go for a longer hike, to explore deeper into the forest surrounding the lake. I packed a small backpack with water, some trail mix, and a first aid kit. making sure to include my hunting knife and a small caliber pistol I always carried for protection against wild animals. I set off along the deer trail I had discovered on my first day, pushing further than I had before. The forest was dense here, the trees pressing close on either side of the narrow path. The canopy overhead blocked out much of the already dim light, creating a twilight world of shadows and muted colors. As I hiked, the silence of the forest began to feel less oppressive and more expectant. Like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I found myself moving more cautiously, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. After about an hour of hiking, the trail opened up into a small clearing. And there, nestled among the trees on the far side, stood an old cabin. It was a rough structure, built of logs and fieldstone, with a sagging roof and shuttered windows. It looked abandoned, the wood gray and weathered with age. Curiosity overcame my caution, and I approached the cabin. The door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, swinging slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. As I drew closer, I noticed deep gouges in the wood of the doorframe, as if something with large claws had tried to force its way in. Or out. My hand shook slightly as I pushed the door open, wincing at the loud creak of protesting hinges. The interior of the cabin was dim, dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light that penetrated the gloom through cracks in the roof and walls. The cabin consisted of a single room, sparsely furnished with the remnants of a simple life. A rusted iron bedstead stood against one wall, a rotting mattress still in place. A rough-hewn table and single chair occupied the center of the room. Shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of rusted cans, broken crockery, and moldering books. But it was the far wall that drew my attention and sent a chill of fear through my body. The logs were covered in a series of deep, parallel scratches. They ran from floor to ceiling in places, the wood splintered and torn. Whatever had made these marks was large, powerful, and apparently desperate to get out. As I ran my fingers over the gouges, feeling the roughness of the splintered wood, a sound from outside the cabin made me freeze. It was a low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, not any animal I could identify. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the open door of the cabin, I could see something moving at the edge of the clearing. Something large, its form indistinct in the shadows of the trees. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, a pair of eyes caught the dim light, glowing with an unnatural yellowish sheen. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, those eyes stared directly at me. I felt pinned by that gaze, like a butterfly on a collector's board. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature melted back into the forest, leaving me alone in the abandoned cabin with my racing thoughts and pounding heart. I don't remember much about my return trip to the campsite. I ran most of the way, heedless of the noise I was making, driven by a primal fear I had never experienced before. By the time I reached the relative safety of my RV, the sun was setting, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and purple. That night, as I huddled in my RV with all the doors locked and windows shuttered, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the darkness was watching, waiting. The sounds of the forest, once soothing, now seemed full of menace. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with nightmares of glowing eyes and shadowy forms with impossibly long claws. I woke frequently, each time convinced I could hear that low, rumbling growl just outside my door. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows of the RV, I made a decision. Whatever was out there in the woods, whatever had left those marks in the cabin and stalked me through the forest, I wanted no part of it. It was time to leave Fremont Lake and return to the safety of civilization. But as I was about to learn, leaving would not be as simple as I hoped. The terror that had begun in the abandoned cabin was far from over. As soon as the sun rose, I started packing up my campsite, My hands shook as I took down the awning and stowed away my camping gear. Every few moments I would stop and scan the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. By mid-morning, I was ready to go. I climbed into the driver's seat of my RV, my palms sweaty on the steering wheel. As I turned the key in the ignition, I sent up a silent prayer of thanks when the engine roared to life. I pulled out of my campsite, tires crunching over the gravel and pine needles. As I navigated the winding road that led back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I checked the rearview mirror, I expected to see something loping along behind the RV, but the road remained empty. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of Pinedale that I began to relax. The sight of buildings, of other cars and people going about their day, helped to ground me. The terror of the past night began to feel distant, almost dreamlike in the light of day. I pulled into the parking lot of the same diner where I'd stopped on my way into town. I needed coffee, food, and most of all, I needed to be around other people. As I walked in, the bell over the door jingled cheerfully. As I walked in, the bell over the door jingled cheerfully, a sound so normal and mundane that it almost made me laugh with relief. The diner was about half full, the morning rush just starting to die down. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, and the chatter of conversation provided a comforting background noise. I slid into a booth near the window, my back to the wall so I could keep an eye on both the door and the street outside. A waitress, her name tag identifying her as Doris, approached with a pot of coffee and a menu. "You look like you've seen a ghost, hon," she said, filling my cup. "Rough night." I must have looked worse than I thought. I managed a weak smile. "You could say that. Had a bit of a scare up at Fremont Lake." At the mention of the lake, Doris's friendly smile faltered for just a moment. It was quick, but I caught it. She recovered quickly, but there was a new wariness in her eyes. "Oh? What happened up there?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. I hesitated. How much should I tell her? Would she even believe me if I talked about abandoned cabins and creatures with glowing eyes? I decided to keep it vague. "Just some strange noises in the night," I said. "Probably nothing, but it spooked me pretty good." Doris nodded, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced by my explanation. "Well, the woods can play tricks on you, especially if you're not used to them. Why don't you look over the menu, and I'll be back in a few to take your order." As she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling me. I glanced around the diner, suddenly aware of the way conversations had quieted when I mentioned Fremont Lake. A few of the locals were casting furtive glances in my direction. I was about to call Doris back and ask her what was going on when the bell over the door jingled again. An old man walked in, his weathered face creased with age, and his eyes sharp beneath bushy gray eyebrows. He looked around the diner, his gaze settling on me. Without invitation, he slid into the booth across from me. "Name's Clyde," he said, his voice gravelly. "Heard you had some trouble up at the lake." I blinked, surprised by his directness. "News travels fast," I said. Clyde snorted. "In a town this size? You bet it does, especially when it comes to that lake." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What did you see up there?" There was something in his tone, a mixture of fear and anticipation. I found myself telling him everything. The silence in the woods, the abandoned cabin, the claw marks, and the creature I'd glimpsed in the clearing. As I spoke, Clyde's expression grew increasingly grim. When I finished, he sat back, running a gnarled hand through his thinning hair. "Sounds like you had a run-in with the Nakut," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The what?" Clyde glanced around as if making sure no one was listening in. "The Nakut. It's an old Shoshone legend. A creature that's part man, part animal. Been stalking these woods for generations. I felt a chill run down my spine. You're joking, right? Some kind of local boogeyman story. But Clyde's expression remained deadly serious. I wish I was, son, but I've seen it myself, years ago. So have others in town, though most won't talk about it. We've learned to leave it alone, stay away from its hunting grounds. But why hasn't anyone reported it? Called in experts or the authorities? Clyde laughed, but there was no humor in it. Who'd believe us? We'd be laughed out of the county. Besides, he added, his voice dropping even lower, some folks around here, they think the Nakut protects the town in its own way. Keeps out unwanted elements, if you know what I mean. I didn't know what he meant, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. My mind was reeling, trying to process what Clyde was telling me. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a superstitious old man, but I couldn't forget what I'd seen in those woods. What should I do? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Clyde's eyes met mine, his gaze intense. You leave, today, and you don't come back. The Nakut, once it gets your scent, it doesn't forget. It'll hunt you, stalk you. It's patient, and it's got all the time in the world. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. I thought about those claw marks in the cabin, the glowing eyes in the darkness. But what if it follows me? Clyde shook his head. It won't leave its territory. But if you stay... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I nodded, pushing my untouched coffee away. I'd lost my appetite. Thank you, Clyde, for telling me this. He reached across the table, his hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. Remember, son, don't tell anyone about this. They won't believe you, and you don't want that kind of attention. Just go home and try to forget. As if I could ever forget. I left the diner in a daze, Clyde's warnings echoing in my head. The sunny streets of Pinedale suddenly seemed sinister, hiding dark secrets behind their quaint small-town facade. I climbed back into my RV, my hands shaking as I turned the key. As I pulled out onto the main road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Clyde stood in the doorway of the diner, watching me leave. And beyond him, at the edge of town where the forest began, I could have sworn I saw a tall, dark figure standing unnaturally still among the trees. I pressed down on the accelerator, the RV lurching forward. I didn't slow down until Pinedale was far behind me, nothing but a speck in my rearview mirror. The drive back to Denver was a blur. I barely noticed the changing landscape, my mind too preoccupied with replaying the events of the past few days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. Every unexpected sound made me jump, half expecting to see the Nakut somehow keeping pace with my RV. I drove straight through, stopping only for gas and to use the restroom. I couldn't bear the thought of spending another night in the wilderness, even in the relative safety of a crowded campground or RV park. I needed to be home, surrounded by the comforting sounds of the city. It was well past midnight when I finally pulled into my driveway in the suburbs of Denver. The streetlights cast a warm, reassuring glow, and the distant hum of traffic was music to my ears. I was safe. I was home. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The world seemed darker now, filled with shadows I had never noticed before. Every creak of the house settling, every rustle of wind through the trees outside my window, set my nerves on edge. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with nightmares. I dreamed of running through endless dark forests, always with the sense of something large and terrible right behind me, its hot breath on the back of my neck. The next few weeks were difficult. I went through the motions of my daily life, going to work, buying groceries, watching TV. but it all felt somehow hollow. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning crowds for a glimpse of something inhuman. I avoided parks and wooded areas, and even the potted plant in my office made me uneasy. I thought about telling someone, my daughter, a friend, a therapist. But Clyde's warning always stopped me. Who would believe me? And what if talking about it somehow summoned the Nakut, drew its attention to me even here, hundreds of miles from its hunting grounds? So I kept silent, carrying the weight of my secret alone. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra projects and longer hours. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to exhaust myself so thoroughly that I might, just might, be able to sleep without dreaming. Months passed. Slowly, gradually, the constant fear began to fade. Not disappear. I don't think it will ever fully go away, but it became manageable. I could go days without thinking about what had happened in Pinedale. I even managed to take a vacation with my daughter and her family, though I insisted on a beach destination. No forests for me, not ever again. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I think I can hear a low, rumbling growl in the distance. And in those moments, I remember Clyde's words. Once it gets your scent, it doesn't forget. I wonder, in my darkest moments, if the Nakut is out there somewhere, patiently waiting. I wonder if one day, years or even decades from now, I'll look out my window and see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. And I wonder, with a mixture of dread and strange anticipation, what will happen when that day comes. It's been over 2 decades since my encounter at Fremont Lake. I'm an old man now, retired from the accounting firm where I spent most of my career. My daughter Emily and her family have moved closer to Denver to help care for me in my twilight years. Life has moved on. The world has changed. But the memory of those few terrifying days in Wyoming has never left me. It's always there, lurking in the back of my mind, coloring how I see the world. I've never gone camping again. Never set foot in a national park or even a heavily wooded city park. My family thinks it's because of my age, or maybe some traumatic event I've never shared with them. They're right about the latter, I suppose, but not in the way they imagine. I've kept my promise to Clyde. I've never told anyone about the Nakut or what I saw in those woods. Sometimes I'm tempted, when I see reports of mysterious disappearances in national parks, or hear campfire stories about strange creatures in the wilderness. But I hold my tongue. It's safer that way. For everyone. But now, as I feel the weight of my years and sense the approach of my final days, I feel compelled to record what happened. Not for fame or notoriety. This account will stay hidden away until long after I'm gone. No, I write this as a warning. A caution to those who might stumble upon the secrets hidden in the quiet towns and deep forests of this vast country. There are things out there, in the wild places of the world, that defy explanation. Things that lurk in the shadows, watching and waiting. The Nakut is real as the scars it's left on my psyche, and I fear it's not alone. So to you, unknown reader of the future, I leave this account. Take it as you will. The ramblings of a frightened old man, or the sober warning of one who has seen behind the veil of our comfortable reality. But remember this. The wilderness is vast, and we know far less about it than we care to admit. Be careful out there. Watch the shadows. And if you ever find yourself near Pinedale, Wyoming, stay far, far away from Fremont Lake. Some secrets are best left undisturbed. There's a certain quiet that comes over a town like Vernon, Idaho. It's that small kind of place where everyone knows each other's business, and if they don't, they'll make up the bits that are missing. I used to joke that Vernon was the kind of town where you could lose your wallet at the diner, and by the time you walked out of the bathroom, 3 people had already found it, checked your ID, and figured out how much they liked you. That was the thing about Vernon. People didn't let you forget who you were unless you wanted to. And sometimes, I think I wanted to. My name is Darren Hawkins, and it was 2003. I'd been a cop here for just about 8 years. Nothing fancy, no high-speed chases, no gunfights in the street. Mostly it was just breaking up high school kids who drank too much or making sure nobody ran the one stoplight we had downtown. It wasn't a hard job, but it was steady, and that meant a lot when you'd grown up around folks who thought the only steady thing in life was the disappointment you got at the end of it. I wasn't married. Never found the right person, or at least that's what I told people when they asked. Truth was, I didn't look much. Vernon was too small for real dating. You could get a drink, sure, but you'd better be ready for everyone in town to know how many you had and if you went home alone or not. So I kept to myself. Just me and the job. Vernon nestled in a valley, surrounded by thick pine forests that climbed the surrounding mountains. The trees were so dense that sometimes it felt like they might just swallow up the town whole. Especially at night, when the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. Most folks around here grew up learning to respect the woods. Don't go in alone, they'd say. Stay on the trails. There were stories, passed down from the old-timers, about things that lurked in the shadows. Things that weren't quite human. Of course, most people didn't believe them. They were just stories, after all. Tales to keep kids from wandering too far. But there were some who took them seriously. Like old Bill Jenkins, who lived alone on the edge of town. He claimed he'd seen things out there, moving in the trees. Things that walked on 2 legs, but didn't look like any animal he'd ever seen. People laughed it off, said Bill had been alone in the woods too long, that he was seeing things that weren't there. But I always wondered. There was something in his eyes when he talked about it. A kind of fear that you can't fake. Like he'd seen something that he couldn't quite explain. But I never dwelled on it too much. I had a job to do, and those stories didn't have much place in the day-to-day of being a cop in Vernon. At least not until that September night in 2003. That's when everything changed. It was a Tuesday night, quiet as could be. I'd parked my patrol car near the edge of town, right where the woods started thickening up and the streetlights disappeared. If you sat there long enough, the world seemed to disappear with it. Sometimes I'd just stare into the trees, wondering what was hiding in the dark. There's something about the unknown that both terrifies and fascinates us. Maybe it's the primal part of our brains, the part that remembers when we weren't at the top of the food chain, when the dark held things that could hurt us. I was lost in thought when the call came through. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. At first, I couldn't quite make out what was being said. The voice on the other end was frantic, cutting in and out. But then I heard it clear as day. Something's wrong. They're dead. I think something got them. I recognized the voice. It was Bethany Mason. She lived on the outskirts of town, about 10 minutes into the forest if you took the winding dirt road past the old sawmill. Her place wasn't much, a small cabin really, but she was known around town. Kind woman, quiet, not the type to lose her mind over nothing. My heart started racing as I flipped on the lights and sirens. The red and blue flashed against the trees as I gunned the engine, sending dirt and gravel flying as I sped towards Bethany's place. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what she'd said. Dead? Who was dead? And what did she mean? Something got them? As I navigated the twists and turns of the old logging road, my thoughts kept drifting to those old stories, the ones about the things in the woods. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Those were just stories, I told myself. There had to be a logical explanation. An animal attack, maybe. But even as I thought it, I knew it didn't fit. There were no bears around here, and the worst we got were the occasional coyotes. Nothing that could do what Bethany was describing. The road ended abruptly, giving way to Bethany's front yard. I slammed on the brakes, sending a cloud of dust up around the car. For a moment, I just sat there, engine idling, trying to prepare myself for whatever I was about to find. Then, with a deep breath, I stepped out into the night. Bethany's cabin looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The front door was wide open, swaying gently in the breeze. The only light came from the flickering porch lamp, casting eerie shadows across the yard. I called out Bethany's name as I approached, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the wind. My hand instinctively went to my holster, resting on the grip of my gun. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but every fiber of my being was telling me that something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I climbed the creaking wooden steps of the porch and stepped inside. The living room was dark and silent. I called out again, my voice sounding oddly muffled in the stillness. For a moment, I thought I heard something upstairs. A faint creaking, like someone trying to move quietly. I drew my gun, flicking off the safety with a soft click that seemed to echo in the emptiness. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed, every step feeling like it might be my last. At the top, I found Bethany. She was huddled against the wall, knees drawn up to her chest, staring down the hallway with wide, terrified eyes. I approached slowly, like she was a frightened animal. "Bethany," I said softly, crouching down to her level. "It's Officer Hawkins. What happened?" She didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the far end of the hallway, towards the bedrooms. I followed her line of sight, but saw nothing but shadows. "They're dead," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear. "Both of them." A chill ran down my spine. I knew who she meant. Her kids, Sarah and Ben. Good kids, polite and friendly the few times I'd seen them around town. The thought of something happening to them turned my stomach. I told Bethany to stay put and made my way down the hall, gun at the ready. The door to the kids' room was ajar. I pushed it open with the barrel of my gun. And that's when I saw them. The scene in that room will haunt me for the rest of my life. Sarah and Ben, lying in their beds, their bodies twisted and broken. Blood stained the sheets, the walls, the ceiling. It was everywhere. But that wasn't the worst part. It was their faces, frozen in expressions of pure terror, like they'd seen something beyond imagination in their final moments. I've seen death before. It's part of the job. Accidents mostly. A few suicides. But this was something else entirely. This was vicious, malicious. No accident could have done this. No human could have done this. I stumbled back into the hallway, fighting the urge to vomit. I had to get Bethany out of here, had to call for backup, for ambulances, I didn't even know. But when I turned around, Bethany was gone. The space she'd occupied just moments before was empty. A soft rustling came from downstairs. I raced down, taking the steps 2 at a time, calling Bethany's name. But when I burst into the living room, it wasn't Bethany I saw. It was a man. At least I thought it was a man at first. But as he turned towards me, I realized my mistake. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its limbs long and thin, like they'd been stretched out like taffy. Its skin was a sickly gray, looking more like weathered leather than flesh. But its face, it didn't have one. Where features should have been was just smooth, featureless skin. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Or rather, I stared at it. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it looking at me, studying me. Then it moved. Fast, faster than anything that size should be able to move. One moment it was across the room, the next it was right in front of me, those long arms reaching out. I fired on instinct. 3 shots, center mass. I saw them hit, saw the impacts on its chest, but it didn't even flinch. It kept coming, those fingers brushing against my shoulder. The touch was cold, so cold it burned, like frostbite on my skin. I swung my gun at it, a desperate attempt to keep it back. But it batted the weapon away like it was nothing more than a toy. I turned and ran, bursting out the front door and into the night. I could hear it behind me, those uneven, loping footsteps. I ran towards the woods, towards the car. If I could just get to the car. But I wasn't fast enough. I felt those fingers again, wrapping around my arm. The cold spread through me, turning my blood to ice. I screamed, but there was no one to hear. No one except... "Bethany!" I yelled. "Bethany, run!" She was standing at the edge of the woods, just staring. Not at me, but at the thing that had me. Her face was blank, expressionless, like she was in a trance. The creature turned towards her, its head tilting in what might have been curiosity. Its grip on me loosened, just for a second. But it was enough. I wrenched free, leaving my jacket in its grasp as I sprinted for the car. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran until I was behind the wheel and the engine was roaring to life. I slammed it into gear and tore out of there, trees whipping by in a blur. It wasn't until I was halfway back to town that I realized I was crying. Great heaving sobs that shook my whole body. I had to pull over, had to catch my breath, had to try and process what I'd just seen. But how could I? How could anyone? This wasn't supposed to be real. Things like this didn't happen, not in the real world, not in Vernon. But it had happened. It was real. And Bethany. God, Bethany. I'd left her there. Left her with that thing. I had to go back, had to... No, I couldn't. I couldn't face that again. I wasn't strong enough, wasn't brave enough. I was just a small-town cop. I wasn't equipped for this. So I did the only thing I could think of. I drove. I drove back to town, back to the safety of the streetlights and the people. Back to a world that made sense. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That something was out there, in the darkness, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. I didn't go back to Bethany's cabin that night, or the next day, or the day after that. I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, about what I'd seen, I felt that cold all over again. I felt the fear, the helplessness. I should have reported it. Should have told the chief. Told anyone. But what would I say? That a monster killed Bethany's kids? That it attacked me? That I left Bethany out there with it? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy. So I said nothing. I went about my days like nothing had happened. I answered calls, wrote tickets, did my job. But it was always there, in the back of my mind. The memory of that night. The official report said that Bethany and her kids had gone missing. There was a search, of course. Half the town turned out, combing the woods. But they found nothing. No sign of Bethany, no sign of the kids. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. There were whispers, of course, rumors. Some folks said Bethany had done something to the kids, that she'd snapped and run off. Others said they'd been taken, that some drifter or psycho had done it. And then there were the old stories, the ones about the things in the woods. People started talking about them again, started wondering, but no one knew the truth. No one except me. I thought about leaving, about just packing up and getting the hell out of Vernon. But where would I go? This was my home, my life. And besides, I had a duty. To the town, to the people. I couldn't just abandon them. So I stayed. I kept my head down and my mouth shut. But I never stopped thinking about that night. Never stopped wondering what happened to Bethany. Never stopped seeing the faces of those kids every time I closed my eyes. It's been years now. The search was called off long ago. Bethany and her kids were declared dead. Their case unsolved. The town moved on, as much as a town like Vernon ever moves on. But I haven't. I can't. Because I know the truth. I know what's out there in the darkness of the woods. I know the evil that lurks just beyond the edge of town. And I know it's still there, waiting. Waiting for what? I don't know. But I do know this. If it ever comes back, if it ever threatens my town again, I'll be ready. I won't run, not again. I'll stand and fight, even if it kills me. Because that's my job, that's my duty. I'm the sheriff of Vernon, and it's my responsibility to protect this town. From anything. Even if it costs me everything. Even if no one ever knows the truth. Even if they never believe me. I'll know, and I'll never forget. Not as long as I live. Which, if I'm being honest, might not be much longer, because I've seen what's out there now. And I don't think it's done with Vernon. I don't think it's done with any of us. But we'll be ready. I'll be ready. Because I'm the sheriff. And that's what I do. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Life in Vernon went on, but it was never quite the same. There was a shadow over the town now, a darkness that lingered in the corners of our eyes and the back of our minds. We didn't talk about it, but we all felt it. The unspoken knowledge that something was out there, something that didn't belong in our world. I threw myself into my work, into protecting the town. I doubled patrols, checked and rechecked every lock and window. I made sure everyone knew to call me if they saw anything strange, anything out of place. Some folks thought I was going a bit overboard. They'd give me these looks, half pity, half worry, like they thought I might be losing it. Maybe I was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it came back. Before it finished what it started that night at Bethany's cabin. I had to be ready. I had to keep everyone safe. The kids in town, they started making up stories about that night. Ghost stories, monster stories. They'd dare each other to go out into the woods at night to see if they could catch a glimpse of the Vernon boogeyman. I did my best to put a stop to that. The last thing I needed was some kid wandering off and... Well, I didn't want to think about that. But despite my best efforts, the stories persisted. They grew, took on a life of their own. Some folks even started claiming they'd seen things, out in the woods or in the shadows of their own backyards. Always out of the corner of their eye, always gone when they looked directly. I investigated every report, every whisper. Part of me hoped I would find something, some clue or trail to follow. But there was never anything there. Just the endless expanse of trees and the weight of my own memories. As the anniversary of that night approached, the atmosphere in town grew heavy with anticipation. It was like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I felt it too, that sense of looming dread. I found myself spending more and more time out at Bethany's cabin. I'd park my car at the end of the old logging road and just sit there, staring into the trees. Somehow, I knew that if it was going to come back, it would be there. Where it all began. On the night of the anniversary, I was out there again. Sitting in my car, my eyes straining against the darkness, my hand resting on my gun. The minutes ticked by, turning into hours. Midnight came and went. And then, as the first hint of dawn began to color the sky, I saw it. A figure emerging from the trees. Tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed to go on forever. It moved strangely, erratically, like a stop-motion creature brought to horrifying life. Even from a distance, I could feel the wrongness of it, the alien nature of its being. I was out of the car before I knew what I was doing, my gun raised, my heart pounding in my ears. I yelled at it to stop, to stay where it was. But it kept coming, shambling towards me with a gait that made my skin crawl. I fired. Once, twice, 3 times. I saw the impacts, saw the thing stagger. But it didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. It just kept coming, those long arms reaching out, grasping. I turned to run, to scramble back to the car. But I was too slow. I felt those fingers, icy even through my jacket, close around my arm. I felt myself being lifted, my feet leaving the ground. I screamed, I fought, but it was useless. Its grip was unbreakable, its strength inhuman. As it dragged me towards the trees, towards the darkness, I caught a glimpse of its face. Or rather, the place where a face should have been. Blank, featureless, like a mannequin or a crude wax figure. But its eyes, deep in the smooth expanse of its skin, I saw them. 2 pinpricks of red, glowing like embers in the dark. That's the last thing I remember before the world went black, before the pain and the cold took over, before reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. I don't know how long I was gone. Days, weeks, months. Time had no meaning in the place I found myself. A place of shadows and whispers, of endless twisting hallways and rooms that shifted and changed when I wasn't looking. I wandered, lost, my mind fracturing a little more with each passing moment. Sometimes I thought I saw the others. Bethany, Sarah, Ben. They were there with me, trapped in that nightmare world. But they weren't whole. They were broken, twisted, like reflections in a shattered mirror. Their eyes, when I could bear to look into them, were filled with a madness I could barely comprehend. And always, always, there was the creature. Watching me, toying with me, breaking me down piece by piece until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Until I started to forget who I was, what I was. But even in the depths of that madness, there was a part of me that held on. A part that remembered Vernon, remembered my duty. And it was that part that finally found a way out, a way back. I don't remember the journey, don't remember how I made it back to the real world. All I know is that I woke up in the woods outside Bethany's cabin, my body battered and broken, my mind barely clinging to sanity. I dragged myself back to town, back to the people I'd sworn to protect. They found me, collapsed on the steps of the sheriff's office, babbling incoherently about monsters and other worlds. They took me to the hospital, pumped me full of sedatives and antipsychotics. They say I was gone for 6 months, that I disappeared the night I went out to Bethany's cabin and hadn't been seen since. They searched for me, of course, but they never found a trace. It was like I'd vanished off the face of the earth, which I suppose I had. Now, I'm back. Back in Vernon. Back in the world of the sane and the normal. But I'm not the same. I can't be. Not after what I've seen, what I've experienced. The doctors, the psychiatrists, they all say it was a break, a psychotic episode brought on by stress and trauma. They say there's no such thing as monsters, no other worlds lurking in the shadows. But I know better. I know the truth. And that's why I have to warn you, have to tell you my story. Because it's still out there. The creature, the darkness, the madness that lurks just beyond the veil of our reality. And it's coming back. I can feel it, in the marrow of my bones and the depths of my shattered psyche. It's coming for me, for Vernon, for all of us. So be ready. Be watchful. And above all, be careful. Don't go into the woods alone. Don't trust the shadows. And if you see a figure tall and dark and impossibly wrong, run. Run and don't look back. Because if it catches you, if it takes you, there are fates far worse than death, far worse than anything you can imagine. Trust me. I know. I've seen it. I've lived it. And I will never, ever be the same. I was only 8 years old that autumn evening in 2016 when Uncle Robert decided I was finally old enough to help gather firewood for Grandmother Rose. The reservation stretched endlessly around us, dotted with juniper and sage that seemed to whisper warnings we couldn't quite understand. Uncle Robert moved with purpose, his weathered hands gripping the axe handle with the kind of certainty that comes from decades of experience. "Stay close," he murmured, though his eyes never met mine. They kept scanning the horizon, watching shadows that shifted between the scattered trees. The air felt thick with something I couldn't name. Not quite fear, but a heaviness that pressed against my chest like a held breath. We worked in relative silence, the rhythmic thud of the axe against dead branches, the only sound breaking the strange quiet. Even the usual evening birds had fallen silent. Uncle Robert's jaw remained clenched as we loaded the truck bed, piece by piece. His movements grew more hurried as darkness crept across the landscape, painting everything in deep purples and blacks. "Time to go," he said abruptly, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool air. The last piece of wood hit the truck bed with a hollow thump that seemed to echo longer than it should have. I climbed into the passenger seat, my small hands fumbling with the seatbelt as Uncle Robert slammed his door shut with unusual force. The truck's headlights carved weak tunnels through the gathering darkness as we pulled away from our makeshift woodlot. I pressed my face against the cool window, watching the familiar landscape transform into something alien and threatening. Every shadow seemed to pulse with its own life. Every cluster of bushes a potential hiding place for things that shouldn't exist. Uncle Robert's knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. His lips moved in what I recognized as one of the old prayers, words in our native tongue that Grandmother Rose had taught him as a boy. The sound was barely audible over the truck's engine, but it carried the weight of generations. The dirt road stretched ahead of us like a scar across the reservation, winding through terrain that seemed to grow more hostile with each passing minute. Uncle Robert maintained a steady 30 miles per hour, his foot never wavering on the accelerator. The headlights revealed only patches of scrub brush and the occasional glint of eyes. Rabbits or coyotes, I told myself, though something deep in my stomach suggested otherwise. No streetlights existed out here. No signs of civilization beyond the worn path we followed. The isolation felt complete, as if we had driven beyond the edge of the world into some forgotten place where different rules applied. My breath began to fog the passenger window, and I found myself drawing nervous patterns in the condensation. Uncle Robert's prayers grew more insistent, though he tried to keep them quiet. I caught fragments of words I half remembered from ceremonies, protection prayers, the kind used when something dark walked too close to the living world. His eyes never stopped moving, checking the mirrors, scanning the roadside, watching for movement that shouldn't be there. The truck's cabin felt smaller with each passing mile. The darkness outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, and I began to understand why Uncle Robert had insisted we finish the wood gathering before full nightfall. This road had a reputation among the elders, stories told in hushed voices about travelers who saw things they shouldn't have seen. A strange weight settled over the entire vehicle, as if the air itself had grown denser. Uncle Robert's breathing became shallow, controlled. His right hand left the steering wheel briefly to touch the small medicine pouch that hung from his rearview mirror, a protection charm Grandmother Rose had made years ago. "Don't look out your window," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the engine noise with startling intensity. "No matter what you hear, don't look." The command hit me like a physical blow. Every instinct screamed at me to turn my head, to see what had prompted such urgency in his voice. But the tone, raw with a fear I'd never heard from him before, froze me in place. That's when it started. A gentle tapping against the passenger window directly beside my head. Tap, tap, deliberate, purposeful. Like someone politely requesting entry, except we were miles from anywhere, moving at 30 miles per hour down a deserted dirt road. My entire body went rigid. The sound came again. Tap, tap. Patient, but insistent. Uncle Robert's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, and words poured from his mouth in rapid-fire Navajo. Prayers I recognized as the strongest protection chants in our tradition. His voice shook with an urgency that made my skin crawl. The truck lurched forward, but the tapping continued, keeping perfect pace with our increased speed. Whatever was out there moved alongside us effortlessly, matching our velocity as if distance and terrain meant nothing to it. My hands gripped the seat so tightly that my knuckles ached. Then the weight hit. The entire back end of the truck sagged downward with a grinding creak of metal and springs. Something heavy, impossibly heavy, had settled into the truck bed among our carefully stacked firewood. The vehicle swayed slightly under the additional load, and Uncle Robert's prayers turned into desperate chanting. Another series of taps came from the rear window right behind my head. The sound was different now, more deliberate, more intelligent. Each tap seemed to say, "I know you're in there, I know you can hear me." My scalp prickled with terror as I fought every natural impulse to turn around and look. Uncle Robert's voice cracked as he continued his prayers, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. The truck groaned under whatever weight we now carried, the engine working harder to maintain our speed. Through it all, the tapping continued, sometimes at my window, sometimes at the back, sometimes seeming to come from directly above us on the roof. Minutes stretched like hours. The weight in the truck bed shifted occasionally, causing the vehicle to rock slightly from side to side. Each movement sent fresh waves of terror through my small body. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to join Uncle Robert's prayers, though I could barely remember the words through my panic. Finally, as abruptly as it had begun, the weight lifted. The truck's rear end rose with a metallic groan, and the tapping stopped. Uncle Robert didn't slow down until we could see the warm, yellow glow of Grandmother Rose's porch light in the distance. Only then did his shoulders begin to relax, though his hands still trembled on the steering wheel. We pulled into her gravel driveway in silence. Uncle Robert sat for a long moment, his head bowed, finishing his prayers before he finally turned off the engine. The sudden quiet felt different from the oppressive silence of the road. This was the normal quiet of a peaceful evening, filled with the distant sound of Grandmother Rose's television and the familiar creak of her old house settling. "Don't mention this to your grandmother tonight," Uncle Robert said quietly, his voice hoarse from chanting. "She'll worry, and she needs her rest. Your father will come tomorrow to perform the proper cleansing." I nodded, though my mouth felt too dry to speak. We unloaded the firewood in record time, both of us eager to get inside the safety of Grandmother Rose's home. She greeted us with warm smiles and fresh fry bread, but I caught her glancing at Uncle Robert's pale face with concern. That night I lay on the familiar sofa in Grandmother Rose's living room, wrapped in one of her handmade quilts. The house felt safe. It had been blessed many times over the years, protected by generations of prayers and ceremonies. But exhaustion warred with the adrenaline still coursing through my system. Sleep refused to come. Every small sound made me jump. The house settling, the refrigerator humming, a coyote calling in the distance. I stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened on that dark road. My 8-year-old mind struggled to understand the terror I'd witnessed in Uncle Robert's face. Around midnight, something changed. A subtle shift in the atmosphere that made the hair on my arms stand up. The house's comforting sounds seemed to fade, replaced by a tension that pressed against the walls like invisible hands. Then I heard it. A soft scuffling along the window on the far side of the room. Slow, deliberate movement, as if something was testing the perimeter of the house. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay perfectly still, afraid to even breathe too loudly. The scuffling continued, moving from window to window with methodical precision. Whatever was outside seemed to be mapping the house, learning its layout, testing for weaknesses. I pulled the quilt over my head, but the sound penetrated the fabric, that persistent scratching and shuffling that spoke of something determined and patient. Through the thin walls, I could hear it moving along the exterior, pausing at each window and door. The sounds were wrong somehow. Not quite the footsteps of any animal I'd ever heard. They were too deliberate, too intelligent, carrying a weight that suggested something far larger and more dangerous than any creature that should be wandering around a reservation home at midnight. The doorknob to the front door rattled. a brief experimental twist, as if testing whether it was locked. The sound shot through me like electricity, and I bit down on the quilt to keep from crying out. The rattling stopped, but I could sense a presence lingering just outside, considering its options. That's when Uncle Robert appeared in the doorway. He held an old kerosene lantern, its flickering light casting dancing shadows across his weathered face. He'd heard it too. I could see the grim recognition in his eyes. Without saying a word, he motioned for me to stay exactly where I was. He set the lantern on Grandmother Rose's kitchen table and closed his eyes, beginning one of the oldest protection songs our people knew. His voice was low but strong, each word carefully pronounced in the ancient way. The melody had power. I could feel it settling around the house like an invisible barrier. Outside, the scuffling grew more agitated. Whatever was there didn't like the song. It moved faster now, circling the house with increasing urgency. I caught glimpses of a shadow passing by the windows, tall and wrong-shaped, bending at angles that hurt to think about. Uncle Robert's song grew louder, more insistent. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me, nodding slightly as if to say that everything would be all right. But I could see the strain in his face, the effort it took to maintain the protective chant. The shadow outside grew bolder, pressing closer to the windows. At one point, I swear I saw it pause directly outside the living room window, its outline visible through the thin curtains. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, as if studying me through the glass. Uncle Robert's song continued through the long night hours. Sometimes the shadow would retreat, disappearing for minutes at a time, only to return with renewed persistence. But gradually, as his prayers built layer upon layer of protection, the presence grew weaker, less focused. Just before dawn, I heard a final scraping sound along the exterior wall, followed by the distant crunch of footsteps moving away through the brush. Uncle Robert maintained his chant until the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, only then allowing his voice to fade into silence. "It's gone," he whispered, exhaustion clear in every line of his face. "But your father needs to come today. This needs to be handled properly." Grandmother Rose appeared from her bedroom, already dressed, despite the early hour. She'd heard everything, but had waited in her room, adding her own silent prayers to Uncle Robert's protection song. Her face was grave as she began preparing coffee and breakfast. "I'll call Benjamin," she said quietly, referring to my father by his name. "He'll know what to do." My father arrived before the sun had fully risen, bringing with him a leather pouch containing sacred items: sage, cedar, corn pollen, and other tools needed for a proper cleansing ceremony. His face was serious but calm, the expression of a man who had dealt with such situations before. We gathered in Grandmother Rose's front yard as my father lit the sage, letting the purifying smoke rise into the morning air. He walked the perimeter of the property, singing protection songs and sprinkling corn pollen at each corner. The ritual felt ancient and powerful, connecting us to generations of ancestors who had faced similar threats. But as the ceremony progressed, I noticed movement at the edge of the yard. Through the rising smoke, dark shapes flickered between the trees, barely visible but undeniably present. They paced along the property line, never coming closer but never entirely leaving either. My father saw them too. His chanting grew more intense, and he gestured for us to form a tighter circle around him. The shapes lingered, almost seeming to dance in rhythm with his prayers, testing the boundaries of his protection. Finally, as the last of the blessing ended and the sage smoke dispersed, they faded back into the forest. My father reminded us all to stay together, to avoid traveling alone, and to call him immediately if anything else occurred. Time passed, and the terror of that night faded into the kind of half-remembered childhood fear that adults dismiss as imagination. I grew up, moved away for college, and found myself viewing those memories with the skepticism that comes with age and education. By 2022, when I was 24 and visiting for a family gathering, I had almost convinced myself that the entire experience had been the product of an 8-year-old's overactive imagination. Almost. The gathering ended earlier than expected, and I found myself with several hours of daylight remaining. On impulse, perhaps to finally put those childhood fears to rest, I decided to drive out to that same dirt road alone. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to prove to myself that there had been nothing supernatural about that night, that fear and darkness had simply transformed ordinary events into something terrifying. The sun was still visible when I started the drive, but it dropped toward the horizon faster than I had anticipated. By the time I reached the halfway point of that familiar route, twilight had already begun painting the landscape in shades of purple and gray. The same oppressive quiet descended, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I drove slowly, remembering every curve and landmark from that night years ago. The rational part of my mind cataloged perfectly ordinary explanations for everything we had experienced. Wind-causing sounds, the truck settling under its load, shadows playing tricks on frightened minds. But as darkness gathered, those rational explanations began to feel thin and inadequate. The road seemed longer than I remembered, stretching endlessly through terrain that grew more hostile with each passing mile. An unfamiliar tension began building in my chest, the same feeling I'd experienced as a child. Then I felt it, the subtle sag in the back of my car, as if something heavy had settled into the trunk. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as memories came flooding back with startling clarity. The weight was exactly as I remembered. Substantial, deliberate, unmistakably real. Every instinct screamed at me to pull over and look, to finally see what had haunted my childhood nightmares. But Uncle Robert's urgent warning echoed in my memory. Don't look. I pressed harder on the accelerator instead, fragments of half-remembered protection prayers tumbling from my lips. A muffled sound came from inside the car. Not quite a thump, but a shifting that made the entire vehicle shudder slightly. Whatever was back there was moving, adjusting its position, making itself comfortable for the ride. I drove faster than I should have on that winding dirt road, my heart hammering as the weight in the trunk shifted occasionally. Just as before, the presence eventually lifted away, leaving my car feeling suddenly light and normal. By the time I reached Grandmother Rose's new place closer to town, where she'd moved in her later years, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. That night, unable to push the memories away any longer, I called Uncle Robert. His voice was calm and unsurprised when I described what had happened. He listened without interruption, then sat quiet for a long moment before speaking. I never told you what I actually saw that night, he said finally. I thought you were too young to understand, and later it seemed better to let it fade. But you have a right to know now. His words sent ice through my veins, but I needed to hear them. I never saw faces, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Just eyes. Glowing like distant headlights, but wrong somehow. They were watching you, specifically, following your side of the truck, tracking your every movement. I swallowed hard, remembering that sense of being observed, of being the focus of something's attention. Why didn't you stop when it first climbed into the truck bed? I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Another long pause. When Uncle Robert spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades-old fear. Because it wasn't alone. Those 4 words explained everything. The multiple tapping sounds, the way the presence had seemed to surround us, the patient way it had circled Grandmother Rose's house. We hadn't been dealing with a single entity that night. We had been surrounded by several of them, all focused on whatever had drawn their attention to me. My father and Uncle Robert had known from the beginning that we were vastly outnumbered. Their prayers and protection songs had been the only things standing between us and something far worse than a simple encounter. They had kept the Watchers at bay through sheer force of will and generations of spiritual knowledge. To this day, I avoid that stretch of road after dark, But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind moves through the trees in just the right way, I can feel them watching, waiting, remembering the child who learned not to look and wondering if the adult will make the same choice. The reservation holds many secrets, and some are better left undisturbed. But they remember us, just as we remember them. And in that mutual recognition lies a truce that depends entirely on respect, distance, and the wisdom to know that some things should never be seen directly. Even now, whenever I visit the reservation, I make sure to arrive before sunset and leave before the shadows grow too long. Because Uncle Robert was right. They're still out there, patient as stone, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to look.